Senator Marco Rubio, thank you so much for joining the New York Sun.
My pleasure.
Okay. Well, there's been lots of buzz in the last few days about the possibility that you might be on the vice presidential shortlist for the presumptive Republican nominee, President Trump. You, of course, had a hard-fought primary with the former president in 2016. Talk to me a little bit about what did you feel when you heard that? You've said that you've been honored and that you haven't spoke to anyone on the Trump team directly, but what goes through your mind when you think about that?
After you've done this a while, reporters have stories to file, and all you need is a couple people to tell you this off the record for you to run with it because they need content. I mean, nobody wants to speculate. I've never spoken to anybody about it, and I think the president is going to have a lot of really good people to pick from in the Republican Party, and I have no reason to believe it would be me. What I have said is, like, anybody who's offered the opportunity to serve this country as vice president should feel honored by that, but I've never talked to him about it. I've never talked to anybody in his campaign about it. We've talked about other things. We've never discussed this. So, like I said, I don't know where these stories come from, to be honest with you, and I imagine next week there'll be a new name to fill the headlines until we finally get to the actual. It's part of the parlor game that's played when these campaigns come around, is speculating on names.
Sure. Can you give us a little insight into what your relationship with the former president is now? What's its tone? What's its tenor?
Well, it's a public thing. I mean, people can track it. From the end of my campaign in we were competitors in 2016. We both wanted the same job, and part of running for the same job is you have to convince people that you're better than the other person. And so I took my shots, and he took his shots. Ultimately, voters chose him in that primary. And then I became, going back to being a U.S. Senator, he became president. We worked very well together. We got a lot of things accomplished and done when he was president. And our relationship has been positive from a work perspective, especially ever since. So, I mean, I don't, other than to say that you know, I got a lot of important things done, good things for the country, for my state while he was president, and I hope he's president again.
Let me shift gears a little bit to news just breaking this morning, and that's the U.S. abstention in the United Nations, just a few blocks from where we're sitting right now. And I want your on the vote in the Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire. I want you to talk about that, but I also want to zoom out a little bit. I want you to reflect a little bit about Senator Schumer's speech, basically sort of agitating for a new prime minister in Israel, and just generally kind of where, you know, as we might be on the brink of a diplomatic crisis between Israel and America, how you see the playing field.
Well, I think all of this is driven by our domestic politics. All of this is driven by the fact that within the Democratic Party, there is a far left, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, pro-Hamas element that is pressuring the Democratic Party on a consistent basis, threatening the president, you know, showing up to disrupt the speeches, standing out in front of the White House and impeding his path to the State of the Union address. I mean, they're facing this pressure. And I think part of this and all of this is an effort to appease them. I think in the case of Senator Schumer and some others, they think they can play it cute by half, which is they can say, we strongly support Israel, but our problem is with Netanyahu. We don't like what he's doing. I think, frankly, that's an incredibly disingenuous argument. If tomorrow Netanyahu was removed as prime minister and someone else got there from the mainstream of Israeli politics on either side without the equation, they would have the exact same policy. The consensus in Israel is pretty firm and pretty strong that Hamas has to be defeated. You cannot have a country in which thousands and thousands of people are permanently displaced within their own country because they're not safe, whether it's living in the north because of Hezbollah or living near Gaza because of Hamas. Hamas has to be defeated. And the goal of Hamas and Hezbollah all through Iran is to make Israel an unlivable place, to make Israel a country where no one wants to live, no one wants to work, no one wants to do business, and no one wants to visit. They know they can't defeat Israel militarily, but they believe they can destroy the country from an economic standpoint and ultimately make it an unlivable hellscape by being able to attack it from Gaza, from the West Bank, from Lebanon, and potentially from other places. So it's existential. And so Hamas has to be defeated. And I do think it is outrageous that we do have political figures in America who purport to be pro-Israel, who are interfering in the politics of Israel. I mean, we don't tell any other country in the world. We don't tell the UK to call new elections. You know, we don't tell others to call new elections. The Israeli democracy is a vibrant one, quite vibrant democracy, quite vibrant system of government. And for us, in the middle of a conflict like this, in the shadows of just a few months removed from a massacre of 1,300 people in a single day by these animals from Hamas, for us to stand up and say, and now is a good time to stoke or try to stoke from the United States, from the safety of the United States, stoke internal divisions in Israel is abhorrent.
So if you were president right now, you would veto this resolution.
Yes, and I would do everything possible for Israel to win.
And would you support the invasion of Rafah?
Well, I support Israel winning, and you can't win without Rafah. You can't win if you allow the core of what's left of Hamas to escape and basically get away with it.
Do you have any insight into what the administration is thinking about Rafah? I mean, how do they envision a post-war Gaza without Hamas eradicated?
I am the wrong person to tell you what they're thinking about it, because they wouldn't share it with me if they've even figured it out themselves. But I think right now they're much more short-term in their thinking, and that is, can we bully and pressure Netanyahu and the Israelis to not go into Rafah so that we can appease this element of our base whose votes we need in Minnesota and Michigan or wherever, and even members of their own staff, because there are members of the White House staff and of the State Department who are out there protesting and so forth. Obviously, as cowards, they cover their face, they don't sign the letters with their own name. So they're facing this resistance even from their own administration. How can we appease these people by preventing the Israelis from going into Rafah? So I don't think they're viewing it from a geopolitical reality. I think they're viewing it from a pure political, domestic election year consideration. And to me, it's, as I said, it's abhorrent.
Have you been surprised by that pressure that's being exerted on the administration?
No, I think it's an element that's existed in the Democratic Party and the far left for some period of time. They sort of coexisted, maybe even ignored it. And now it's come to a head. Now it's emerged. It's the same as people that woke up when they say, oh, I can't believe how many radical anti-Semites are in American academia. I can't believe our universities allow Jewish students to feel unsafe. And even reach the point of where they hide their identity as Jews because of the situation on campus. People are surprised by it, but we've allowed that to fester. We've allowed it to exist without addressing it for a long period of time, because maybe you agreed with those people on 5 or 6 other things and they were part of your political coalition. Now the price is being paid for it. Now it's been unmasked, and now we've confronted that ugly reality. I imagine that some elements like that might exist in what some would term the far right, but it is predominantly today loudest and most pronounced on the far left, and it's a key activist core for the Democratic Party.
Sure. We've seen that electorally as well as vis-a-vis policy. Let me ask you about another hot button issue, and that's immigration. You've obviously been at the forefront of trying to reform, seems like maybe a weak word, but really re-envision kind of what our immigration policy looks like. I know you were sort of against the bipartisan bill that came out of the Senate. There's kind of legal jujitsu going on in Texas right now with a volleying between the Supreme Court and kind of the Fifth Circuit. What do you think is next there?
Well, first of all, we're not facing this is not immigration. Immigration is people moving to this country through some process. This is mass migration. This is 9 million people over a 3-year period of time crossing the border of the United States unlawfully, illegally, and residing in our country, being released. That's what we're facing. So this is not even immigration. On the contrary, this is the opposite of immigration in some ways, because immigration is an orderly process, which this country's always had. 1 million people a year move to this country permanently with a green card, legally. This is on top of that. 9 million people, 3 years. It's untenable. It's having an impact all over the country. And I think what we're watching now is a lot of communities that for a long time would argue that they were against any sort of measures on the border, because they assumed, I imagine, that every immigrant who entered the country illegally was going to stay in El Paso, or they were going to stay in San Diego. But now they've spread out throughout the country, and now communities are facing the price of it. And now all of a sudden they want something done about it. Primarily they just want more money for it. But some of them are saying that it needs to be controlled. So I think the first thing that has to happen is this has to stop. And the way it stops, we don't need a new law. We need the president to reverse his executive orders. He took office. He decided he was going to do the opposite of what Trump did, and it led to this migration. And the reason why he won't do those executive orders, even though that is the rational thing to do, is because it would require him to admit that Trump was right, and he doesn't want to do it. And so as long as people know that if they come here illegally and they turn themselves in, they have a 90% chance of being released, and they're going to get to stay for a long time with a work permit, more people are going to come. And that number is going to continue to climb.
Was coming out against the bipartisan bill a tough decision?
No. First of all, it wasn't a bipartisan bill. I like James Lankford very much. I respect him. I think he did the best he could. But this was a deal negotiated between 2 senators, one a Republican and one a Democrat. But I wasn't involved in those negotiations. I never signed over my proxy. Senators are allowed to negotiate whatever they want. Ultimately, the rest of the body has to vote for it. This bill had serious problems. And as would any product of compromise in this issue because of the priorities of the left. One of the biggest problems I had with this bill is that it would hire this asylum corps, 1,000 new asylum officers who would have the power for the first time in American history to not even have to go to a judge, to be able to award asylum right there and then at the border and confront, listen, and decide, okay, you're going to get asylum. That's a pathway to citizenship. The minute you get asylum, you are now 5 years away from your green card, and then after that, applying for citizenship. So that's the first point was a huge problem that I had with that. I think that would incentivize more people to come. It also allowed them to give them immediate work permit, not even the 6-month wait. Another magnet would have brought more people here. So I think that deal had a lot of flaws. It had things in it that were good because James got them put in there, but he had to give. And the things he gave on were the things that the senator involved in this, from the Democratic side, bragged about. He bragged about how the border would never be closed, how even with the emergency powers the president would have, the president could decide not to use them, and at no time would any numbers fall below a certain amount. So I get it. They want to call it a bipartisan deal. I never voted on it. I didn't negotiate it. It wasn't my deal, and I don't feel bound by it in any way, so it wasn't hard to be against it at all.
Let me hop to another hot button issue, and that's abortion. Are you comfortable with kind of where your party is on abortion going into the election season?
Well, we have different opinions.
Where would you like the party to be? Or are you comfortable with a kind of chorus of opinions rather than one?
Yeah, look, I don't think that's ever an issue you're going to find unanimity because it's a tough issue. I've always acknowledged it. It's a very, very difficult issue, and it forces us to confront a very fundamental question, and that is, how do you weigh competing rights? The right of a woman to decide what to do with a pregnancy and the right of an unborn human being to live. And you have to weigh these two, and they're in conflict in this scenario. And I feel very strongly on the side of the right of a person to live. It's the most fundamental right we have. And I can believe that without in any way diminishing the difficulty on the other side of it. I mean, you're 16 years old, you're pregnant, you're afraid that your parents are going to find out, you think your whole life is over because of this. That's a tough situation to be in. I do not diminish that. At the same time, if we don't protect innocent human life and we start defining what kinds of life are worthy of protections, I mean, that not only is that real sort of a moral question for the country, it puts us on a very dangerous, slippery slope. So to me, it's not even a political issue. It's a fundamental issue. Now, how that's regulated and legislated, what the Supreme Court decided is that states, through the political process, can have those debates and make those decisions, and that's where we are. Now, within my party, there are pro-choice Republicans and who have a different point of view in this regard. What I do think we should all agree on is, number one, and abortions are not, even if you support them being legal, we should all agree that there used to be a time when Democrats used to say they should be safe, legal, but rare. They lost the rare piece of it. And the other thing I think we can all agree on is that we must ensure we do everything we can in our laws so that children are not viewed as a burden, which is why I've focused a lot on what can we do to make sure that women who are owed child support for that child are receiving that child support. What can we do to help a college student understand the resources available that they don't have to drop out of school just because they got pregnant? It's important for us to do what we can to be pro-family beyond simply the question of abortion, because I don't ever want to live in a country where children are seen as some sort of burden that ruins your life.
You were at the forefront of efforts to change how TikTok is in America, to kind of, force its Chinese owners to divest. Talk to me a little bit about that. Would you support a full ban? And secondly, how do you kind of, looking in a broader, wider lens, think about kind of being a limited government sort of conservative and, talk about the First Amendment, or just generally, this is a pretty striking governmental intrusion into kind of, let's say, private business. How do you think through the issues involved?
Well, first of all, I think that the fundamental obligation of the federal government is to protect us from foreign threats. The government does a lot of things that maybe it shouldn't be doing, but one of the things it has to do is protect us from a foreign threat. So the issue is not TikTok, the platform per se. People can say it's annoying, they may not like the videos that are on it, but the real threat is not TikTok. The real threat is that the algorithm that basically drives TikTok, the algorithm that reads your mind and determines what videos you see, which videos are spread, that algorithm is not owned by TikTok. It's owned by ByteDance. ByteDance is a company in China. I don't care where they have their headquarters. They are a company that resides in China. Their engineers are in China. And under Chinese law, they must do with that algorithm whatever the Chinese government tells them, even if they don't want to. Even if ByteDance says we don't want to do it, by Chinese law, they have to do it. And that means if the Chinese government in a time of conflict decides we want you to alter the algorithm to ensure that Americans are against the U.S. helping Taiwan, they have to do it. They have no choice but to do it. Now, there's all kinds of frivolous arguments that come. That ByteDance is owned by shareholders that are not Chinese. That's irrelevant. They have to still comply with Chinese law. That the data is stored in the United States. It doesn't matter where you store the data. The algorithm only works unless the engineers in China have access to the data. That's the fundamental issue here. And there's no First Amendment issue. Listen, if ByteDance divests and it's bought by a company anywhere in the world, it doesn't even have to be an American company, as long as they're not subject to the national security laws of China, that's what we're trying to achieve here. And if people want to post videos that support China, they have a right to do it under the First Amendment. What they don't have a right to do is to have foreign ownership of an algorithm that's controlled by a foreign adversary, in this case in particular, the Chinese Communist Party. And they do control it, because by their law, if they ask for something, the ByteDance has to do it whether they want to or not.
It's very helpful. A lot of our readers have spent lots of time in Florida, or have second homes in Florida, or just love the state.
Good.
Talk to me a little bit about the state of Florida politics. Were you surprised by how Governor DeSantis did in the primary? Not surprised? What kind of, as we turn the corner to November, how do you think about your state? And
well, look, I always thought President Trump was going to be the nominee because he was, in essence, running as the de facto incumbent. And it's very difficult to beat an incumbent president of your own party. I think there are a lot of Republicans that are dissatisfied with the way the elections turned out in 2020, and I don't think they thought the answer was to find a new candidate, especially with President Trump running. So I thought he was always going to be the nominee. I felt that way from the beginning. I don't care who to run against him. Nobody in the Republican Party was going to beat him for that nomination. I think Florida's going very well, and population numbers prove it. I think it's going very well for Republicans, where just a decade ago, we had a 500,000 or 600,000 voter registration deficit, and today there are almost 900,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats. So it tells you the direction the state is trending. Like every state, we have challenges. Our property insurance issues are profound and growing, and it's been a real constraint on a lot of people. No state is perfect. No state is without challenges. Rapid growth always brings additional challenges. But I still think that the numbers prove and have shown the number of people moving to Florida has, over the last few years, away from other places, I think shows what the direction of our state has been very positive.
Let me ask you one more question. I was intrigued. We at the Center are very attuned to constitutional issues, and I was intrigued by some of your comments or thinking about the immunity question that's currently before the Supreme Court vis-a-vis Trump. So I was just wondering, to think out loud a little bit, how you think about that kind of really bedrock constitutional question about the immunities of the president.
I mean, there's 2 points to keep in mind. And again, I haven't thought through this. I'm not presenting the oral arguments. I have no idea how the Supreme Court's going to rule, and it's a novel case in some cases. But I do think there's two things. There's a legitimate issue here. On the one hand, right, I mean, presidents, no one's above the law. President can't go murder someone and say, you're not, nothing you can do to me about it. Although I imagine a president who murdered someone would probably be, impeached and removed, and then they would be subject to criminal justice. But the second, at the flip side of it is, do we want to live in a country where partisans can basically threaten a president and say, I know you're president now, but if you don't do what we want you to do, or you do things that we don't want you to do, when you get out of office, we're going to sick all of our state prosecutors, all of our federal prosecutors, all the agencies we control.
Do you think that's what's happening to President Trump?
I don't think there's any doubt that that's happening right now. There's no doubt. I mean, if you look at the business cases being charged with, you have the lender. One of the lenders was Deutsche Bank. And Deutsche Bank basically says, we don't care what Donald Trump valued his properties at. We did our own internal assessment. It'd be the same as I went to get a loan from a bank. The bank's not just going to trust me. They're going to do an appraisal of their own and come up with by the way, a loan he paid back. He wasn't deficient, didn't default on it. And then, some of the numbers they're setting on it. Mar-a-Lago alone, living in Florida, is probably worth more than what the bond they're trying to ask for here is. So all of this is absurd. That's just one example. You look at the classified documents case, the damage, there's no victim. There's no allegation that those documents were turned over to the Iranians or the Russians or sold to the Chinese or the Saudis. There's no victim in Paul. Should those documents have been there? No, they should not have been. But should that case have been prosecuted? Absolutely not, because it has divided our country and created scandal and division that undermine confidence in our judicial system and in our criminal justice system.
Do you think the January 6th case should have been prosecuted?
No. Again, I think that if you give a speech and somehow people who were at that speech and some people that were not at that speech, Okay? Some of the people that broke into the Capitol that day and committed acts of violence, they should be prosecuted. But some of them were not at the speech, nor were they listening to it online. They had already gone to that city to do what they were going to do. And to somehow say because of the speech you gave, it led to that. Because of the speech you gave, you tried to, that's absurd. That's so tomorrow, when some Democrat gives a speech and says Republicans have blood on their hands because they don't pass gun control, and then some lunatic goes out and kills a Republican because we're murderers, right? We have blood on our hands. Should that person be held liable and put on trial for calling for that? So I think, again, it goes back to the same point that under no other period of time in our nation's history would someone have been prosecuted there on that. Not to mention the Georgia case, which is a joke. Not to mention the one in New York is the biggest joke of all, which is the one about the payments that violated a federal law, even though he wasn't charged under a federal law, what they call hush payments. I think people see it for what it is, and that is they impeached him after he was out of office. They've unleashed state prosecutors who all promised to do this even before they knew what the charges they were going to bring is. A special counsel who's brought charges in D.C. where there's no way Trump gets a fair trial in front of a D.C. jury. Federal charges in Florida because they had to. It's Mar-a-Lago. On case after case, a defamation lawsuit by this lady. It's people see it for what it is. It's an all-out assault. And then on top of all of that, supposedly serious people trying to keep his name from being on the ballot. Right. They had to go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Senator Marco Rubio, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Yeah.